In the year 1943, the globe was in the midst of the biggest war in history. World War II had a grip on the nation's attention, and due to Japanese internment camps in California, Chicanos replaced Asian Americans as the largest minority group in Los Angeles. The war had already been raging for nearly 4 years when, in the city of Los Angeles, a civil conflict was sparked. A group of servicemen would take their attention away from the war and focus it on the Chicano citizens of Los Angeles. These events would become known as the Zoot Riots. But before we get into the riots themselves, it is important to understand the history behind the Zoot Suit. First appearing in Harlem dance halls, the Zoot Suit was a suit purchased multiple sizes too big for the wearer and was tailored at the cuffs to help it maintain a baggy look while fitting in a way that the wearer would not trip on the excess fabric. The suits were a popular trend on the East Coast during the 1930s, and eventually their popularity expanded west when celebrities like Cab Calloway began to don the look. When the suits found their way in Los Angeles, Chicano youth were quick to embrace it. Children and adolescents alike could be found sporting the suits all throughout the city, from street corners to diners and theaters. Due to the ongoing war, soldiers and sailors from all over the country who had no experience with Chicano culture were thrown into the highest concentrated area of Mexican Americans in the nation. The culture was foreign to them, and tensions began to rise. Servicemen saw many Chicano youth as draft dodgers, even though many were too young to serve. But most of all, soldiers and sailors saw the Zoot Suit as unpatriotic and disrespectful in nature. It was believed at the time that any and all available fabric should be reserved for the military to aid the United States in the war. Racial tensions in the city continued to rise when on June 3, 1943, a group of sailors claimed to have been attacked by a group of Zoot Suiters. However, the Zoot Suiters maintained that it were the sailors that instigated the fight. The next day, some 200 sailors armed themselves with clubs and took to the streets of East Los Angeles hunting for defenseless Chicanos in search of revenge. When they spotted a group of young Zoot Suiters, they did not hesitate to attack. The sailors relentlessly beat and stripped the boys, and when they had had their way with them, they burned what remained of the suits. These were just the first attacks of a series of events that lasted over a week. Thousands of servicemen from around the Los Angeles area, and even those stationed in San Diego, 100 miles away, made the trip to join the riots. Instead of stopping the altercations, police officers would often look the other way, leaving defenseless citizens to be beaten by massive groups of sailors, soldiers, and white citizens. The Chicanos were often even arrested by the police, supposedly for their own protection. Taxi drivers would even provide free rides to sailors that were trying to reach rioting areas. Make no mistake, these riots were direct attacks on minorities in the city, as the assaults were not exclusively on Chicanos, but also some black and Asian citizens as well. One of the most vicious attacks of the riots came when a black man was ripped from the driver's seat of his car and dragged into the street in broad daylight, where he was beaten and his eye was carved out with a knife. All the while, local newspapers and broadcasts portrayed the victims as thugs and gangsters, a narrative that lives to this day, while they painted the attackers, the aggressors, and the instigators as patriots defending their land from a violent threat. Mexican American community leaders and officials reached out to the United States government in desperate search of assistance, and yet for days they were met with little to no action. The riots did not subside until Army and Navy officials declared Los Angeles off limits and barred servicemen from leaving their barracks. Shockingly, there were no reported deaths from either side during the riots. However, the trauma from the events that occurred from June 3rd to June 8th in 1943 remain a scar on the face of our relatively new culture. And even as one of the most important events in Chicano history, this is not a topic often discussed or taught about in classrooms across the country, not even in the areas that the riots took place in. The Zoot Suit riots are one of the many instances of racism and hatred in American history. The riots did not happen over a piece of cloth. The riots did not happen because of a fashion trend. The riots were a reminder, as if one was ever needed, that hateful people will never fully accept other cultures, races, or religions, in not only this country, but anywhere they are not native and have been deemed that they do not belong. With each year that passes, more and more people forget about this event. More and more people that were there to experience it have passed from this earth, and more people are born that will never be taught about this time in Chicano history. Nearly a century later, the few that still remember still embrace the culture with respect for the sensitivity of the past. To this day, you can still find Chicanos fighting injustices that our people have met in the past and continue to meet. To this day, you can still find Chicanos educating their children about the history of their people. And to this day, you can still find Chicanos on their lowriders proudly rocking a Zoot suit.